Who decides what we remember? Not in a philosophical sense, not as an abstract question about human nature or the passage of time. I mean literally. Who makes the decisions about what history gets taught in schools, what artifacts get displayed in museums, what maps get preserved in archives? Who curates the past? Someone chose what stays and what disappears. Someone decided that certain civilizations matter and others don't. Someone determined which maps are accurate and which are outdated. And when you look at who these people were, when these institutions were founded and what they chose to exclude, the timing becomes impossible to ignore. I wasn't looking for a conspiracy. I was trying to understand how historical knowledge gets standardized. How does an entire country, diverse states, different schools, competing philosophies, end up teaching the same version of history? Well, the answer isn't organic evolution. It's institutional design. And it all happened during one specific period, 1840 to 1920. The exact same 80 years when Tartaria vanished from maps, when old world architecture stopped being built, when massive cultural erasure programs operated openly. But this time, the erasure wasn't happening in insane asylums or utopian communities or orphan trains. It was happening in institutions we still trust today, institutions that decided what counts as real history, institutions that chose what evidence matters and what gets forgotten, and nobody questions them, because they're not a secret society. They're the Smithsonian Institution, the American Historical Association, the National Education Association. They're official, respectable, scientific, and they all formed during the exact period when Tartaria disappeared. Let me show you the timeline. August 10th, 1846. The Smithsonian Institution is established by Act of Congress. Its mandate, for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Noble goal. But here's what nobody talks about. The Smithsonian doesn't just preserve knowledge. It decides what knowledge is worth preserving. James Smithson's bequest arrived in 1838, over $500,000 in gold. Debates raged for 8 years about what to do with it. University, observatory, library. Congress chose a museum and research institution. And immediately, the Smithsonian became the arbiter of what artifacts matter. The United States Exploring Expedition, 1838 to 1842, had already amassed thousands of specimens, animal specimens, plant specimens, shells, minerals, tropical birds. All became part of Smithsonian collections. Then, the Mexican Boundary Survey, the Pacific Railroad surveys, Native American artifacts, natural history specimens. The Smithsonian decided which of these were scientifically important, which would be displayed, which would be studied, which would be cataloged as valuable evidence of the past, and which would be stored in basements, uncatalogued, forgotten. One institution, controlling the physical evidence of American history, founded in 1846, right when Tartaria was disappearing from maps. But the Smithsonian only controlled artifacts. What about the narratives, the interpretation of history itself? That required a different institution. 1884, the American Historical Association is founded. Before 1884, history wasn't even a distinct academic discipline. Well, wealthy men with leisure time wrote history, independent scholars. Competing traditions preserved different versions of the past. But the AHA changed everything. Suddenly, history was professionalized. The association established high professional standards for historical training and research. They created the American Historical Review, reviewing history books, for their conformity to the new professional norms and scholarly standards. Conformity, not accuracy, not completeness, not preservation of multiple perspectives. Conformity to professional norms. Who set these norms? The AHA's first president, Andrew Dixon White, president of Cornell University. First secretary, Herbert Baxter Adams, who established one of the first history PhD programs at Johns Hopkins. University presidents, academic elites, people with institutional power. And they decided what counted as real history. From the AHA's own description, a junior scholar learned what it meant to be a historian of a certain sort. Of a certain sort? Meaning other sorts weren't acceptable. Other interpretations, other sources, other narratives about civilizations that don't fit the timeline. Those got filtered out through the peer review process, not because they were wrong, because they didn't conform. The AHA even influenced what got reprinted after the fires. Remember, between 1800 to 1900, massive library fires swept Europe and America. St. Petersburg, London, Paris, Boston, New York. When books were reprinted, when surviving manuscripts were authenticated, who decided which were genuine and which were forgeries? The AHA universities, state-controlled institutions. But from Project Knowledge. Who decided what got reprinted after the fires? Who chose which surviving manuscripts would be authenticated and which would be dismissed as forgeries? not independent scholars working in isolation, not competing traditions preserving different versions of the past, but centralized institutions, state libraries, national archives, universities operating under royal or governmental charters. The AHA's Congressional Charter, 1889, established it for the promotion of historical studies, the collection and preservation of historical manuscripts. Think about that. They don't just study history, they control the preservation of historical manuscripts. They decide what's worth saving. And they were founded in 1884. The same period maps of Tartaria were being replaced with Turkestan. The same period Russian cartographers, under direct Tsar patronage, were conducting geographic surveys that were actually military reconnaissance missions. The same period, European cartographers relied exclusively on Russian sources for information about Central Asia, because Russia controlled access to the region, and Russian officials decided what names appeared on maps. The AHA did the same thing for historical narratives. They controlled access to legitimate history, but controlling artifacts and narratives isn't enough. You need to control what gets taught. That required standardizing education itself. 1892, the National Education Association convenes the Committee of 10. Well, their charge, taking stock of current practices in American high schools and making recommendations for future practice. Sounds reasonable. But here's what they actually did. They standardized the curriculum across the entire United States. Before 1892, states had their own education systems. Different schools taught different subjects with different emphasis. The Committee of 10 changed that. Their 1894 report recommended that every subject which is taught at all in a secondary school should be taught in the same way and to the same extent to every pupil. Same way, same extent, every pupil. 9 core subjects: Latin, Greek, English, modern languages, mathematics, sciences, natural history, including economics and government, and geography. Notice what's on that list. History, not histories, not multiple perspectives. History, singular, standardized, uniform. And who decided what this history would include? The Committee of 10 was largely composed of representatives of higher education, university presidents, professors, academic elites, the same people who controlled the AHA. Charles William Eliot, president of Harvard, chaired the committee. William T. Harris, commissioner of education. James B. Angel, president of University of Michigan. These weren't random educators. These were the institutional gatekeepers, and they decided what history would be taught to every American student. From the committee's own report, they aimed to create curriculum standardization and uniformity among the secondary school course offerings. Uniformity, one version of history, taught the same way to every student, starting in 1892. The same year, the Russian Geographical Society was conducting its most intensive surveys of Central Asia, surveys that resulted in Tartary disappearing from maps. Now, here's where it gets disturbing. These institutions didn't just standardize what was taught, they decided what was excluded. The AHA's early meetings focused heavily on defining what counts as historical evidence. Translation: deciding what sources are legitimate and which are not. Maps showing Tartaria? Outdated. Buildings with architectural features we can't replicate? Misattributed. Photographs of giants, fabrications. Documents describing advanced pre-1840 civilizations? Unreliable. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, because it doesn't conform to the standardized narrative. From Project Knowledge, the nature of what was considered knowledge shifted. The kinds of texts deemed worthy of preservation narrowed. The editorial standards, the cataloging systems, the very framework for understanding history, all of it standardized. Who set these standards? The same institutions. Smithsonian, 1846. AHA, 1884. Committee of 10, 1892. All founded during the 1840 to 1920 period. All given authority to decide what counts as legitimate history. All excluding the same things. Evidence of Tartaria, advanced pre-1800 technology, civilizations that don't fit the approved timeline. Let me show you how this worked in practice. The Russian Geographical Society, founded 1845 under direct Tsar patronage, conducted scientific surveys of Central Asia in the 1850s. But the explorers were military officers. The surveyors were army engineers. The scientific expeditions were reconnaissance missions. And the maps they produced showed Russian territorial claims, not neutral geographic information, not local names and traditional boundaries. Russian administrative divisions, Russian place names, Russian political control. When Russian maps stopped using Tartary and started using Turkestan, European cartographers followed, not because they independently verified the change, but because their Russian sources no longer provided information labeled as Tartary. The name disappeared from maps because the people controlling the territory wanted it to disappear, and they controlled the information cartographers used. The same thing happened with historical narratives in America. The AHA controlled which manuscripts were authentic. The Smithsonian controlled which artifacts were important. The Committee of 10 controlled which history was taught. And when all three institutions excluded evidence of the same civilization, that civilization disappeared from public knowledge. Not because the evidence was destroyed, because it was deemed not conforming to professional standards. But it gets worse. These institutions didn't work in isolation. They coordinated. The Committee of 10's report specifically mentions working with the AHA. The Smithsonian's collections informed university research programs. The AHA's standards influenced which books libraries purchased and preserved. The National Archives, established largely through AHA efforts, decided which government documents were saved and which were discarded. It was a network, an institutional gatekeeping system, and it controlled every level of historical knowledge production. 1. Physical evidence, Smithsonian. 2. Scholarly interpretation, AHA. 3. Educational curriculum, Committee of 10. 4. Archive preservation, National Archives, established through AHA lobbying. 5. Publication standards, American Historical Review. 6. Museum displays, Smithsonian and affiliated museums. 1 coordinated system, deciding what counts as history. Operating 1840 to 1920, the exact period Tartaria disappeared. Now ask yourself, why did all these institutions form when they did? Why not earlier? Why not later? Why did the professionalization of history, the standardization of education, the centralization of archives all happen during one specific 80-year period? The official answer, natural evolution. Industrialization, modernization, scientific progress. But consider an alternative. What if these institutions formed specifically to control the narrative during a period of massive historical revision? What if their purpose was to standardize a new version of history before anyone who remembered the old version could contradict it? Look at the timing. 1840s. Massive utopian movement begins, isolating 100,000 plus educated people. 1846. Smithsonian founded. Controls artifacts 1850s to 1890s. Peak period of insane asylum expansion. Isolating confused people who claim to remember things differently. 1854 to 1929. Orphan trains move 250,000 children. Disrupting family heritage. Transmission 1884. AHA founded. Controls historical narratives 1892. Committee of 10 standardizes curriculum. Controls what's taught 1900 to 1924. Americanization movement erases immigrant cultural memory 1920. Utopian communities disbanded. Tartaria completely gone from maps. New history fully standardized. It's not random evolution. It's coordinated stages. First, isolate the witnesses, asylums, utopian communities. Second, disrupt cultural transmission, orphan trains, Americanization. Third, establish institutional control. Smithsonian, AHA, Committee of 10. Fourth, standardize the new narrative, education, archives, museums. Fifth, wait for everyone who remembers to die. By 1920, mission accomplished, new history established, old history forgotten, institutional gatekeepers in place to maintain the narrative. And here's the most disturbing part. These institutions still operate today. The Smithsonian still decides what artifacts are displayed. The AHA still sets professional standards for historians. The curriculum they standardized still forms the basis of what we teach. The archives they established still control access to historical documents. Meaning, the institutional network that erased Tartaria in 1840 to 1920 is still the institutional network controlling historical knowledge today. Not a secret society, not shadowy figures in back rooms. Respected institutions, operating openly, with congressional charters and federal funding, making the exact same decisions about what counts as legitimate history. Let me show you how this still affects research today. From Project Knowledge, go to any major library, request original manuscripts from before 1750. Not facsimiles, not published editions, but the actual physical documents. You'll find they're rare, extraordinarily rare. And the ones that exist often share certain characteristics. They come from royal collections, from state archives, from institutions with direct ties to governmental power. The independent monastery libraries? Lost. The private scholarly collections? Lost. The merchant guild archives? Lost. But the state-sanctioned material survived. Convenient. And who decides which of these surviving documents researchers can access? The same institutions. Or many manuscripts are still held in private collections, sealed by families who control access. Others are in university archives, where researchers must justify their requests according to academic standards. Others are in government archives, classified, restricted, or simply uncatalogued. The gatekeeping didn't end in 1920, it just became normalized. Now consider what this means for any research into Tartaria. Academic historians won't touch it. Why? Because it doesn't conform to AHA professional standards. Because the evidence doesn't come from approved sources, Smithsonian certified artifacts, AHA authenticated manuscripts, government archives. Because it challenges the standardized curriculum that's been taught since 1892. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, because the institutional gatekeepers have decided it's not legitimate. And anyone who questions this gets labeled a conspiracy theorist. Not for claiming a secret cabal controls history, but for pointing out that official institutions operating openly have been controlling historical narratives since 1846. That's not conspiracy. That's documented institutional power. Let me ground this in something concrete. The Committee of Ten's report states that before their work, there was no recognized consensus of opinion in the country at large, not one generally accepted judgment, not even one well-known point of agreement, which would serve as a beginning for a consideration of the place of history in the high school curriculum. No consensus, multiple versions, competing narratives, different interpretations. That was in 1892. By 1894, the committee published their standardization recommendations. By 1900, while most states had adopted them. By 1920, one unified version of history was being taught nationwide. What happened to all those competing narratives? What happened to the different interpretations that existed before standardization? They were filtered out, not preserved, not debated, not included in textbooks, simply excluded from the standardized curriculum. And within one generation, the generation taught this new curriculum, nobody even knew the alternatives had existed. And that's how you erase a civilization from public consciousness. Not by burning books, though that happened too, but by controlling what gets taught, what gets published, what gets preserved, what counts as real history. Let the institutional gatekeepers do it. Give them congressional charters, federal funding, academic authority, and let them operate for 80 years. By the time they're done, the erasure is complete, and nobody questions it, because it wasn't done by a shadowy conspiracy. It was done by the Smithsonian Institution, the American Historical Association, the Committee of 10 official, respectable, scientific, above suspicion. So now ask yourself, when you learned history in school, who decided what you learned? When you visit a museum, who decided what's displayed and what's in storage? When you read a history book, who decided which sources are reliable and which are discredited? When you search for historical documents, who decided which are accessible and which are restricted? The answer is always the same. Institutions founded 1840 to 1920. During the exact period, Tartaria vanished, operating under the same professional standards they established then, making the same decisions about what counts as legitimate history, and excluding the same evidence, maps, buildings, photographs, documents that don't fit the standardized narrative. Not because they're fake, because they don't conform. Here's what nobody talks about. These institutions had a choice. When the Smithsonian received artifacts showing advanced technology that predates accepted timelines, they could have displayed them prominently, studied them intensively, made them central to understanding American history. Instead, most ended up in storage, uncatalogued, inaccessible to researchers. When the AHA encountered manuscripts describing civilizations that don't fit the official chronology, they could have preserved them, published them, made them available for scholarly debate. Instead, they were deemed unreliable sources and excluded from the professional canon. When the Committee of 10 standardized curriculum, they could have included multiple historical perspectives, competing narratives, alternative chronologies. Instead, they chose uniformity, one version, taught the same way to every student. These weren't accidents, these were choices, made by people with institutional power. During a specific period, with a specific result, Tartaria disappeared. And before you say, that's just how institutions work, consider this. The professionalization happened remarkably fast. In 1870s, history barely existed as an academic discipline. By 1900, it was completely standardized, with established professional norms, required credentials, peer review processes, and a single approved narrative taught nationwide. 30 years. That's not natural evolution. That's coordinated institutionalization. And it happened during the exact period when massive cultural erasure programs were operating openly, insane asylums exploding in size, 250,000 children on orphan trains, 100,000 plus people isolated in utopian communities, Americanization programs erasing immigrant heritage, or World's Fairs displaying primitive peoples, all between 1840 to 1920, all coordinated, all resulting in the same outcome. Cultural memory broken, alternative narratives suppressed, official history standardized, and institutionalized through the Smithsonian, AHA, and Committee of 10. So that even after the asylums closed, the orphan trains stopped, the utopian communities disbanded, The institutional gatekeepers remained, still controlling what we remember, still deciding what counts as history, still excluding evidence that doesn't conform. So here's the real question. If institutions founded during the period of Tartaria's disappearance are still controlling what counts as legitimate history, and if those institutions systematically exclude evidence of Tartaria, how would we ever know what really happened? We wouldn't, because the evidence would be dismissed as not conforming to professional standards, because the sources would be labeled unreliable, because the narrative would challenge the standardized curriculum that's been taught since 1892. Not because it's false, because it doesn't conform, and conformity is what these institutions were designed to enforce. Your grandfather might have learned a different version of history before the Committee of 10 standardized it, before the AHA professionalized it, before the Smithsonian decided which artifacts matter. But by the time you were taught, that institutional network was fully operational, deciding what you learned, what you saw in museums, what books were in libraries, what sources counted as credible, all based on standards established 1840 to 1920. During the exact period, Tartaria disappeared. And nobody questions it, because these aren't secret societies, they're respected institutions, operating openly, with congressional charters, making decisions about what we remember and what we're allowed to forget.